Hey everybody, my name is Emily Sweeney. I'm with the Boston Globe, and I want to thank you for joining us for this episode of 3 Requests, 3 Stories. This class is part of our ongoing series on New England state public record laws and the Federal Freedom of Information Act. I urge you to check out our previous lessons, which can be found on the New England First Amendment Coalition's website and also the YouTube channel. And we have a great new multimedia FOI guide at NEFAC.org. You should definitely check out if you can. These lessons are sponsored by NEFAC with support from the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, MuckRock, SPJ New England, and the New England Society of News Editors. With us today is Allie Jarmanning of WBUR. Allie is a senior reporter at WBUR, and she focuses on criminal justice and police accountability. And Allie, I want to thank you so much for joining us to walk us through some public records requests you've done.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is awesome. So public records in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is one of the hardest states, I think, to deal with in terms of public records, just because of the ways that our laws are, the number of exemptions that we have. And so it makes it a little tricky, but there are things that you can get a lot of records, and there's lots of tips and tricks to do so. But we're going to start with just 3 kind of basic requests that you can put in and that you can get stories right away, get the records right away, and hopefully they won't be too complicated. So let's dive in. So the first one that I want to talk about is rosters or salary databases, basically like who works for the city or town that you cover or that you're interested in, who, or for the agency, whatever it might be. So for me, I cover Boston Police a lot. And so I have always asked for their roster, who works there, what positions do they have, that kind of thing. Sometimes salary data is included when you ask for these kinds of things from cities and towns. Other times it's separate. Like in Boston, for instance, they have their salary data online. They release it in like the beginning of the year, each year for the previous year. And you can kind of see exactly where people work and what they're making and how it breaks down, whether it's, overtime or regular pay, injury pay, that kind of thing. And the thing about like these kind of documents is it's really good to have for just like ongoing reporting. And so any agency that you cover, it's great to ask for these kinds of things, because then something might happen down the line when you're like, oh, does this person that was accused of a crime work for this agency? Or maybe you want to get in touch with somebody that like no longer works for the agency and you have a copy of a data or a roster from a couple of years ago. Maybe that person can become a source, something like that. But it's just really good to have. So you're like, when you're on deadline, you don't have to like ask for this thing and wait 10 days and all that kind of stuff. So here's just an example of the request or part of a request that I put in, I think last year for the Boston Police Department. And so it has like kind of the general, you can find like a form letter online of this is a request under the Mass Public Records Law, blah, blah, blah. I'm requesting to be provided. And I asked for the roster or database, including sworn and civilian personnel. And then I listed some fields that it might include. So rank, where the person is assigned, their hire date, base salary. I think when I put this one in, I had an idea of what was in the database already. So that's why I put in some of those things. But I also said, I think I have in there, usually I put something in like, included but not limited to, so they don't just only give me certain fields just because I thought to ask for them. I also on here asked for like the record system or software system, because sometimes they will tell you, oh, we can't download it. And if they tell me what the system is, then I can look up the manual and be like, actually, you can press this button. But anyway, did not need to do that in this case. But also available electronically, that's a really important part, because you don't want to end up with like a PDF of, a huge data set. So here's what I got back, and this is probably kind of hard to see, but it's basically like a list of who the people are, their ID, last and first name split up, blah, 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 start date. I don't know if I could keep going. Here's all the stuff that I got. Zip code, where they live, their job title, the unit they're assigned to, and their race. And like, this is great to have. And like I said, for future reporting, but like, is there really a story there in this data set? So that's where I started just like browsing through and looking at it. And I noticed that there was one column called task profile description. And it seemed to say where officers were assigned. So like what district, or their homicide unit, whatever. And I saw that a lot of officers were listed on this medically incapacitated unit, which is weird. And actually more were there than in any other unit. Which seemed kind of crazy. 1 in 8 police officers was assigned there. And so I thought, oh, well, this might be a story. And so then I'm like, well, how do I figure out how long that like how many of these people have been in this unit for a long time? Because this roster that I got was just a snapshot in time. So maybe like there was like a mass, like, you know, a bunch of officers hurt themselves and they were all going to come back, and like maybe it was just like this blip kind of weird thing. So that's when I turned to salary data. And so in Boston, we're really lucky because it's broken down by a bunch of different categories. So we have like, this is the salary data that I pulled, and I organized it by injury pay. So I could see how many officers were getting almost all injury pay versus regular pay. And I'll spare you the kind of like the data details, but basically I was able to show X number of officers were mostly off for a year because I could see, oh, they basically only got injury pay and none of their regular pay. So then this is the story that I ended up with, that Boston police officers, some Boston police officers have been on medical leave for years. Some of these officers have been out for 3, 4, 5 years, 95% or more of the year. Maybe they came back for a couple weeks, but went back out again. And so that's kind of the story that I end up with, just from like looking at this roster that I would have asked for anyway, and asking myself, well, this looks a little strange. And I should give a plug to our great data reporter at BUR, Saurabh Datar, who did a lot of the work in R on this. So rosters and salary data, go ask for that. And this is just like the nut graph of the story, that 12% of the Boston officers are on medical leave, 15 police officers were on leave for 4 more years. And a nice pretty chart. Okay, other thing that you can ask for, lawsuits and settlement payouts. So agencies get sued, cities and towns get sued. That information is a public record. And it's also a public record when they pay money for a lot of these settlements. Like you might see when maybe something's announced that there was so-and-so Boston police settled a lawsuit with somebody over a police brutality case for an undisclosed amount, but they do have to disclose that amount in records. And so that's what you guys can ask for. Other thing adjacent to this is costs for outside counsel. So if you're a small city or town, a lot of times they'll hire outside attorneys to represent them in a case. You could ask for that too, which can be really interesting. So here's my request for, this is actually the response I got from Boston when they said, okay, we received this, but this is what I asked for specifically. An updated list of settlements, and I had received this earlier, so I provided like, hey, this gave me this last year. My request was for any payouts, settlements, other monies spent to address lawsuits or misconduct claims filed against the Boston Police Department or any of its members, which is pretty broad. And I had gotten this previously, so they knew what I was asking for, and just to make it even easier, I provided them the copy of what they gave me before. So again, here's what I got back, and this might be a little bit tricky to read, but it was basically of course, it was a Excel spreadsheet that they had turned into a PDF, but you know, what are you gonna do? They're plaintiffs, defendants, so a lot of these look like lawsuits, basically. Coburn Mark versus Sean Deary, Sean McCarty, the docket number, where it was filed, US District Court, so it's a federal case. Plaintiff's attorney, this one was pro se, that means they represented themselves, but there's a bunch of other where it lists the attorney. And then whether it was a settlement or a judgment, so a settlement's gonna be, you know, we came to an agreement, there wasn't a trial, the date of it and the amount. So it doesn't give me like all the information I need, but I can scroll through here and say, hey, there's some that I might wanna look at. Like, you know, if this had just was more recent, this 2012, you know, $1.4 million settlement, I'm going to look up like, oh, what was this case, Michael O'Brien versus David Williams, and et cetera, et cetera. I might call the attorney. It's great that they have that listed. I can find out what's going on. So the other thing you might get back, so that was Boston, what they gave me back, kind of like the spreadsheet. The other thing you might get back is the actual settlement agreement. So this is Worcester, and just part of what they gave me, it was like a couple pages. And this was the actual, like, here's the agreement that both sides signed. And so it's basically like the actual raw document of what Boston gave me. So, but it gives me kind of the same information. It gives me the attorney, the person who was the plaintiff, or the person who was, you know, alleging whatever it was, when the incident was, how much it was for, how much the settlement was for. And so then I can go through that and say, hey, I might want to call on this one, or it seems kind of interesting. So here's one of the stories that came out of when I did this request last year. There was a settlement given, and I should give credit to the Globe because they reported this first, but the this man, Frederick Clay, was in prison for 10 years or a number of years, and he got a settlement from Boston police. And I can't remember the details of that case about what, there was some kind of like witness tampering or issues with the investigation. He was freed, and then Boston paid out $3.1 million. They did not report that out publicly. There was no lawsuit. Frederick Clay's attorneys just sent a letter to the city basically like threatening a lawsuit, and they ended up paying. But I was also able to, because I had that data set, say, hey, here's how much Boston spent over the last 10 years on these kinds of claims. So that is one story that came out of that. I'm working on another story right now out of a different, on a different settlement. So like these can be like very fruitful documents. Third thing, contracts and bids. So everything a city or town or an agency pays for, there is some paper trail. So you can ask for contracts if there's a request for proposal or information, solicitations like that, bid documents, like if there's a big project happening in town, like who is putting in to do the project, you know, what are they promising, what's the scope of work, what is the city or town saying that they want. So an example of how I used or asked for these kinds of documents and came up with a story was, I don't know if everybody remembers a couple of years ago, the whole Amazon HQ2, when all the cities and towns were like, oh, Amazon, come to us. We have all these great things. We'll give you tax breaks, et cetera, et cetera. And in Massachusetts, there was a couple communities that put in for it. Boston did, Somerville did. So I'm going to focus on what I asked for from Somerville. So these are actually two different requests here. So one was my first request, kind of just asking for like, what did you give Amazon? Like, what did you, any incentives, tax breaks, offerings, any emails or memos in the city that was like discussing this whole thing? I'm pretty sure the first answer I got from them was like, no, we don't have to give this to you because it is attorney-client work product. But then what they did respond to me with gave me more information. So they said that Amazon had provided a questionnaire to the city related to the company's search for a second headquarters. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I would like, you know, the questionnaire. I want to see what Amazon was asking. Like, what did they want to know from all these cities and towns and communities? So you can see that this is my appeal, and that's how I found out about it. So what did I do with that, with what I got back? So this was the request or for information that Amazon had sent to all the cities and towns, like, oh, you're in the second round. So here's what we want to know, and had to like just a little bit about like, what about Amazon and what they want. But so then I get the whole questionnaire. So I start working on a story. I just did like kind of a short story, like here's 6 things Amazon wanted to know about Somerville for its HQ2 pitch. And so I think I have it. My favorite part of it was they wanted to know the cost of living in each city. So they asked basically like, what does it cost for avocados and bread and a tall, you know, latte at Starbucks, blah, blah, blah. What was it? Yeah, specify the cost of a basket of goods in your community, gallon of 2% milk, whole wheat bread, and an avocado. So very particular. And Whole Foods is owned by Amazon. So I just did like this like kind of like silly story basically about that, but also, you know, about a thing that was like heavily in the news and everybody was like kind of a buzz about. So then, spoiler alert, Somerville did not get HQ2, nor did Boston or anything else. So when that came out, I put in another request for Somerville's answers to the questionnaire. So then this was the next story I did, which was Somerville sweetened Amazon HQ2 bid with marshmallow fluff, not tax breaks. And I have to give credit to that headline to Cal Borchers of WBUR, who is a master of headlines and really made this story. So part of the answers that Somerville came up with, I note as I'm reading through, and they're just talking about like, oh, you know, the regular, we're so great, we have, our city's so smart, et cetera, et cetera. They mentioned the Fluff Festival, which I just thought was like kind of hilarious to the, like, you know, all these cities and towns are promising tax breaks and they're like, but did you know that fluff was invented here? So that was kind of the, it wasn't even a very long story, but I think it did pretty well. And it kind of gave a little insight into what was going on. And oh, the cost of an avocado is $1.25, or at least was at that point. So, so takeaways here. Think about proactively asking for records that might come in handy. So like rosters, lists of investigations, settlements, like we talked about. You might not need them right now, but they might come in handy down the line. Like I'm just thinking about the roster and how it has like the race of all the officers that work for Boston Police. Like maybe I'm working on a story and I just want to be able to say like what percentage of officers are white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, whatever. And if I just have that information handy, I don't have to like ask the PIO. I don't have to wait for the information. It's just like I have it there. Be curious about what you get back. Like it might not be obvious. Like I think about the medically incapacitated story. Like if I didn't even know what I was really looking for, it was just kind of like, oh, this is a weird thing. I should find out more about that. Same thing with like the bid documents and everything. Like if I was looking for a very like straightforward, like hard news story, like I would not have written about marshmallow fluff. Like honestly, those bid documents were kind of boring and not exciting and probably not story worthy on their own, but there was like little tidbits in there that could be a story if you put them all together. Use your calendar. So like ask for updated versions each year of these records. So like the settlements, the rosters, things like that, list, you know, investigations against employees. Like am famous for just like putting something on my Google Calendar like 6 months or a year out, just to remind me to ask for something again, because I will forget. Don't forget about following up on stories. So like the medical incapacitated story is a great example. Like I need to do a follow-up on that because like, has anything changed since I did that story 10 months ago? And then just like some other things, like review other requesters' appeals. That will give you some ideas of like what people ask for and what's available. So like if you go on, and there's a link here, like if you go on the Secretary of State's office, they list all the appeals that come through and the decisions. So you can kind of tell from there sometimes like what's being asked for. So that can just give you some ideas. And the other way to get ideas is ask for your city or town or agency's public records log. So they have to keep track, and I think it's like in the new public records law, they have to send it every year to the Secretary of State's office, but they also have to like keep track of like who is asking for what, or they should be. And so you can ask for that and see, you know, who is asking for what and what might be available for you to pick up on yourself. The other thing I just want to add is like sometimes the records you don't get are the story, and I can tell you an example of this, but like I asked for like a few years for body camera footage from Boston Police after that so-called straight pride parade. And they told me they didn't have any body camera footage, which was like really interesting because they had just started this whole body camera program. And so I wrote a story. Basically, it turned out that all the officers who were working there that day were on overtime, and officers on overtime didn't have to wear body cameras, which seemed a little nuts. So I ended up writing a story about that, and it got some good traction. And so it's just like proof that like, you know, if you request your cities or towns rosters or salary database and they can't give it to you, it's like, what the heck's going on there? So just something else to think about. So this is my information. If you want to reach out to me, my Twitter, my email, like I love helping people with this kind of stuff. So please reach out if you have any questions or have any ideas or are getting stuck at anything. So thanks so much.
Allie, this was so great. Seriously, very informative. And you know, and again, I want to thank you for going over the 3 requests. It's really cool to see how many stories you got out of those requests too. Again, Allie, thank you so much. And if we don't have any questions, I think we're going to wrap it up. And yeah, thank you so much.
Cool.
Thanks
No, thanks so much.
joining.